they are preparing legislation. So this is the moment to share reflections and to give us common principles so that for once we need not to harmonize European law when it is too late, but that we can define principles before starting to have national legislation. So I want just to give a last word on the timetable. So the report has been presented. It is currently discussed in 6 different committees in the European Parliament. The deadline for amendments is the 25th of October in our Committee for Legal Affairs, and we will vote on the report on the 29th of November. So I think this is too late to have the plenary in December, but certainly in January. So thank you for your attention. And now I will give immediately the floor to, I have difficulties to pronounce, to Madame Nathalie Nevejans. C'est correct? She is lecturer at the law faculty of Douai in France. She will speak in French sur les règles européennes de droit civil en robotique.
On the civil law rules on robotics. You have the floor. Thank you very much indeed, Chair. And thank you very much indeed for inviting me here to your working group today. It's a great pleasure for me to join you. I'll be talking about my comments on this report. Just a few comments to start with. Firstly, do we need a legislative instrument for legislation? Now, paragraph 25, unfortunately, you can't see very well on the PowerPoint. If you look at paragraph 25, we have a proposal for a legislative instrument on robotics. Now, this is particularly relevant and justified in sectors where current legislation cannot meet the needs of the sector. For example, there is a lack of legal opinion in the sector, and so a legislative instrument will be very useful indeed here. At the same time, if you look at the development of autonomous robots and their role played in society, we look at perhaps how the interaction between humans and robots will change. It's the questions of ethics which may well completely change society in the future. So it would be worth looking at this question as a whole in order to ensure that we can retain the humanist values of our current world. So if you look at this paragraph here, we can see that the text should look at the problems which you set out. So I think this is an excellent idea. And it should also be subject to regular revisions to follow progress made in technology. Now, on the one hand, we've looked at the broad principles underpinning this report, but on the other hand, the focus has also been on ethical issues. Firstly, the broad principles underpinning the report. The technological limits of the notion of a smart robot. So I thought it was very interesting to take some time to talk about smart robots. Now, we're talking here about machines who can anticipate certain situations, can adapt to situations with the aid of sensors and become autonomous. So the idea of intelligence or smart robots is very common in robotics. In the same way as we have ISO standards for robots in robotics for smart robots. Nevertheless, although the term smart robots is used on a daily basis in robotics, in Europe in civil society or as a whole, there's a certain degree of suspicion about smart robots and how it can be used. Now, let's start with the Western fear of robots. Elsewhere, there was a positive view of robots, a futuristic view, for example, as an object with a soul. For example, in Japan, we have a very positive view of robotics. But you can see that the approach in the West has been a lot more fearful. The Golem, for example, or literary work in the 19th and 20th century, which have viewed robots as a fruit of dangerous creators. So there is an underlying fear here. And Bill Gates, for example, in 2014, 2015, spoke at length about the dangers of artificial intelligence. So it may well be that Western citizens may not take kindly to a text on robots. It may feed this fear and hold back developments in robotics. There are other problems related to development of robotics, a socio-economic risk, for example. This was mentioned in point E of the report. We have to try and reconcile two different groups of stakeholders. Firstly, the fact that the development of robotics will have a significant impact on European economies. So we mustn't try and hold back developments in this area. At the same time, schools and universities have to develop to ensure that education is suitably adapted to this new world and these new changes to society and this future industrial revolution. But from a social point of view, the advantages of robotics go hand in hand with certain risks when it comes to employment. Studies have shown that thousands of jobs may disappear in Europe because of automatization. This will have an impact mainly on working physical jobs, but not exclusively. For example, in the area of teaching, jobs may well be affected as well, and that's something to think about. Other studies have shown that there will not just be jobs disappearing entirely, but to transfer jobs to perhaps service industries. So we do have to take these perhaps with a grain of salt, because certain service jobs are being affected by robots, for example, in the care industry, but we have to be cautious of making generalizations here. Certain service providers may use this excuse to get rid of employees. So we have to try and ensure we can protect new jobs which may well be created. Now, robots should be used to support humans in their work and not replace them. But there are certain fears about robots which have shown that the term smart robot may well in itself create problems. Similarly, the issue of self-awareness and conscience and the role played by Asimov's laws in robotics. Point L of the report says that until such time that robots become or are made self-aware, Asimov's law must be regarded as being directed at the designers, producers, and operators of these robots. But I think this is worth thinking about. Asimov's laws, as you all know, Asimov, who is an author who in the middle of the last century drew up his laws of robotics. This was the first time that a writer of science fiction had tried to master their own creation by applying a set of literary laws. Now, of course, they're not legislative instruments, but they were just a way to create a tension effect, a plot twist, as it were. He wasn't trying to do anything other than just create a literary tool. So the idea of these laws are designed to master the robots, so not the producers or manufacturers, and they should not be viewed as such. They were not designed to determine actions committed by humans. So self-awareness of robots. This should not be regulated as under point L. What would be the point of creating a self-aware robot? Why would we do this? How would it serve humanity? Now, this is perhaps an intellectual problem, but it's worthwhile looking at it in terms of the impact on humanity, because we only have a very vague idea of what might happen. A robot which is by its very nature faster, more intelligent, perhaps more perfect, almost immortal, could perhaps lead humanity into danger or result in its extinction. So I believe that research into awareness of machines is potentially very dangerous for humans, should be very carefully regulated. So what dangers might entail the creation of a legal personality for a robot? If you look at paragraph 31, the question of a legal personality or legal status for robots should be a central part of civil law regulation for several reasons. Firstly, a moral status, a moral personality. If you look closely at this, you can see that a legal personality has already been attributed to non-human objects, but you shouldn't use this simplified analogy, because the status of a moral personality is a legal fiction which allows us to carry out certain actions in a legal world. Behind a moral personality, there is always a human being who will represent this object. But when it comes to robotics, who stands behind the robot? Does the robot himself represent himself? I mean, how can a machine with no self-awareness, no feelings, no free will, how could they act for themselves, represent themselves in a court of law, for example? So we need another way to determine liability, and the creation of insurance and a compensation fund could be a way of doing this. This leads us on to the dangers of ensuring a specific legal status for a robot. So look at the rights which under this status a robot may have, because if you say you are going to give a legal status to a robot, then this goes hand in hand with rights and obligations. So what rights might a robot have? Perhaps the right to life, so the right not to be destroyed, the right to dignity, the right to equality with humans, the right to a pension or fair payment. These these rights are covered under paragraph 31b of the report. Those are just examples. Could a robot ask for fair payment or fair wage before looking after an elderly person? Could a robot refuse to put itself into danger because it believes it's not fairly paid to do so? I mean, I don't believe this would be reasonable. So at the end of the day, why do we have a robot? Why would you buy a robot? Rights and obligations for robots could be potentially destructive for this emerging sector. So I think it's important to avoid doing this. Now, those who argue for a legal status for robots have a strange idea of robotics. They believe that robots are the equivalent of androids or robots with a human appearance. But you can see that robots can take any form at all, as can be seen on the pictures of this PowerPoint. So the danger is not that we may be attributing rights and obligations to a mere tool, but it's perhaps demoting the human to the status of a mere machine. A robot should serve humanity, and should any other rights or obligations should be found only in science fiction. Now, the responsibility or liability for harm caused by an autonomous robot. On point S of the report, to sum up, says that we should have new rules to see how a machine can be held responsible for its acts or omissions. So the autonomy of a robot means we have to consider the liability of such a robot. We are envisaging creating a robot who has a certain has an ability to learn, to self-learn. So these new rules, which could be adopted, would not necessarily be applied until previous rules were no longer applicable. So harm or damage caused by an autonomous robot could always be blamed on a fault in the machine, and the current liability laws could also be applied to a certain extent to damage caused or certain damage or harm caused by autonomous robot if they are not being correctly used by the user. In any case, I don't think it would be appropriate to make a robot fully liable for its actions. Only a human can bear full liability for the damage caused by a robot. Now a few words on the provisions under paragraphs 27 and 28. This is just very quick reading of Article 28, which sets out a way in which we could assess the liability of each party. Now, this is a very interesting idea, but perhaps I think we need to make the situation a lot clearer for the courts, because there are distinctions here which may be difficult to implement in real life. We mustn't forget that the different hypotheses which could arise should also be considered. For example, the different types of robots, for example, robots used in commerce. So setting up a system of specific liability for an autonomous robot would coexist alongside a classic regime which would apply to all other robots could give rise to serious problems. If there were to be damages or harm, some parties may make a claim under the more favorable regime. They would pick and choose their regime. So a court would then be forced to look on a case-by-case basis at the characteristics of a robot in order to assess whether or not they meet the definitions of an autonomous robot or not, so as to know whether or not to apply the new set of rules. And this would really drag out legal issues. This brings us to the ethical aspect of robotics. These were mentioned at several points in the draft report. There are some very interesting points which we won't have time to look at today, but paragraph 6, for example, says that when looking at developments in robotics, we would have to think about the guiding ethical framework for the use of robots. And this is very important. We have ethics for robotics, which for certain researchers is called roboethics. This school of ethics is applied to humans, to the creators or the manufacturers or the users of these robots. And we have to distinguish this from the ethics of a robot itself, which is imposed upon the robot itself by the robot. So these are robots who are forced to respect certain ethics, but at the moment that's a purely theoretical case. So what would be the broad principles of roboethics to protect humans from robots? Now, from an ethical point of view, there are a number of broad founding principles which should be respected to protect humans. Here are a few examples. The principle of the protection of humans against harm caused by robots. Now, current law legislation is pretty effective in this area, as in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, for example. A second principle, for example, the right to refuse to be cared for a robot. So a human could refuse to be dealt with by a robot, and there is legislation in this area at the moment related to the question of human dignity. So that's a concept which already exists. Now, the principle of protection of the human freedom, or the right to freedom, if a robot were to exhibit dangerous behavior towards a human, now and again in the Charter of Human Rights, there's a right to freedom. That concept already exists, but the robot could force a human to act in a certain way or prevent them from doing so. So we're going further than existing text. In an exceptional case, perhaps we could forbid a robot from imposing its point of view unless third parties were involved or to ensure that the robot did no harm. Now, the fourth principle for the protection of humans against attacks on the private life by a robot. The right to a private life is protected in law as well, but in roboethics there are further risks involved. Take the example for robots in the care industry. A person who consents, who may consent to attacking a private life may well be the same people who have made the purchase, who have bought the robot. For example, family members who have bought a robot to care for a family member. The family member also has to consent to the usage made of this robot. Now, the principle of the management of personal data used by a robot. Here we have the 2016 European regulation, which is perfectly adapted to this situation, except that this text will not necessarily be suitable for the wide array of questions which might arise for roboethics. For example, communication of data which cannot be registered by humans but from robot to robot. Autonomous robots could represent a danger for employees, for example, robots working in the care industry. The roboethics principle of the protection of humans against risks of being used by a robot. For example, robots which are designed to facilitate interaction between humans and machines, but the emotions expressed by the machines are 100% simulated at the moment. So a relationship developed between a human and a robot could be identical from a human point of view to relationships developed between human and human. So we have to ensure that humans cannot be used or abused by robots, and there are no rules existing in this area. So perhaps we need information provided to those who are buying robots as to the fact that this might be the case. Now, there are another principle on avoiding the breakdown of social structures in the presence of a robot. For those who are working in the care industry, again, expenses may be incurred if a person in need of care stays at home, but a robot could be used to reduce costs. But the presence of a machine in this particular case could become the norm, where it should be an exception, because it could result in greater social isolation. We need, as a principle, a rule that would prevent the breakdown of social structures by a robot. We've said that a robot or a machine could substitute all human presence in this area. Equality of access to progress in the area of robotics. This is designed to ensure there is no breakdown in robotics. Robots could be used by professionals in industry, those who are buying very expensive machines or robots, but robots are used by individuals should also be covered by this. Europe is based on values of solidarity, equality and fairness. So here we could justify equal access to robots. At the same time, we have to bear in mind the cost of robots for certain sectors. For example, those providing personal care, surgery robots, or artificial limbs. Then finally, the restriction of access of humans to certain technologies. This goes hand in hand with MBC developments. Whether or not humans can access certain skills or developments which augment what they currently have, it would be worth thinking about the rules which would restrict robot actions in this area.
And moving on to the legal values developed by the Charter on Robotics, paragraph 6, the Charter, or the draft report, excuse me, aims to establish a charter in which there would be a certain amount of text, a code of conduct for engineers, ethics for the ethics committee, and ideas for users. And the idea is to create a charter that would underpin these various ethical ideas. Now, obviously, the charter isn't legally binding unless it becomes part of contracts, so it would be necessary to remain vigilant. In particular, in some countries, different meaning might be given, different emphasis might be given to different ethical charters. For example, in France, an ethics charter would suggest a text that is legally binding. To conclude, this ethical charter will have to be looked at very carefully because it may well become formalised as part of contracts. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for that. Mrs. Nevejans. I'm going to adapt our agenda a little bit now.